What's up, legends? Welcome back to my Unmatched Strategy Guide series. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the first and only currently released Marvel hero, Deadpool. Now, I know there's been a little bit of a gap in between this video and the last one that I posted, but to quote the great Bo Burnham, "I'm sorry I was gone, but look, I made you some content." I have a few assumptions before we get into the actual bulk of the character. The first of which being this deck is a little quirky and the cards do not look like normal Unmatched cards, so I might have put the wrong name for certain cards, but honestly that doesn't really matter that much. I'm just going to call them what I like to call them. In addition, there are a few kind of trivial cards that I shouldn't really need to talk about, especially since this video is going to be pretty long since there are 30 different cards. So I'm going to skip over the things that I can, and hopefully based on your previous knowledge with Unmatched, or maybe you've seen some of my other videos, that can help clue you in on the value of certain cards. There are a couple cards in this deck that are very meta and they break the fourth wall because, again, it is a Deadpool deck. I'm not going to go into specifics with that because a lot of how those cards work depends on how you and your opponent want to play them, and does this bowl of soup I have on the table count as food, and are shorts pants? You know, like, you can figure that stuff out on your own, and I'm going to skip over those just because it's up to user discretion. Also, this video is going to be pretty long, probably. My videos have been exponentially increasing in length. And I'm not really sure why. I guess I just started talking more. So please, halfway through this video, get up, go eat some fruit snacks or a handful of cashews or a banana, take a walk in the sunshine, get some vitamin D. Lord knows we both could use some. And lastly, this is a Deadpool deck, but it's not a joke deck. It was designed to be played like any other Unmatched set. It just has comedical overtones, so you should still take it somewhat seriously, and I'm making a whole strategy video on this, so I'm taking it seriously. So do what Ryan Reynolds would want you to do and proceed with maximum effort. Alright, on to the stats. Deadpool's stat block is one of the most disappointing things I've ever seen, but let's just go into it. Deadpool is a melee fighter with 10 health and move value of 2 and no sidekick. Move 2, yep, worse than move 3, but you didn't need me to tell you that, and you only have a couple of movement effects on your cards, so you're not a very mobile character, and oftentimes if your opponent sticks their sidekick in between you and their hero, you're probably just going to have to brute force your way through it instead of going around. This also puts you at a pretty big disadvantage against ranged heroes, move 3 heroes, and the dreaded ranged move 3 characters, which for some reason exist. Still don't know why. 10 starting health is horrible. I shouldn't have to explain that. You're a solo hero, so 10 health is your hero HP and your total health pool, so not a lot to work with. However, this is offset a little bit by the consistent healing that your ability provides you, and you do have a slew of HP recovery on your cards, so it's not like you're the Raptors where they only have 7 health each and that's it. You do have ways to get health back, but at the same time, a lot of your block cards are pretty bad. They're only blocking 2 or 3 damage, and normally that's fine. Like Bruce Lee has a lot of 3 value block cards, but Bruce Lee has 14 health and you have 10 health. So you take 2 or 3 big hits and you're just dead if you're not blocking a lot of that damage. In addition, you have the Sherlock Holmes problem where you have exactly 15 cards in your deck that you can block with, and you don't have a lot of card draw, which means on your turn, if you double maneuver, on average, one of those cards is going to be a card you can block with. And if you're playing against an opponent that has bonus attacks or action gains or some way to attack you more than once on their turn, eventually you're going to run out of block cards, and that's where only having a maximum hit point total of 10 really hurts you. So be aware that you don't have a lot of card draw and you don't have a lot of block cards, so you have to make every block count. You are solo, you don't have a sidekick, and as we've seen with other solo and melee heroes like Jekyll and Hyde, Invisible Man, and Bruce Lee, you have low board presence and flexibility. What that means is you can't execute pins because you only have one fighter, although there is a specific spot on Raptor Paddock. I was told by Zero Skater 12 that you can execute pins there, so thanks for that tip, Zero. Obviously, he's the Jekyll and Hyde Invisible Man master, so he would know that. And it's really easy for you to get pinned on the flip side because there's only one of you, and if you're playing against someone with multiple sidekicks especially, it's going to be really easy for them to pin you. In addition, you don't really dictate the positioning on the board because you only have one fighter on it. So any other opposing hero, if they have a sidekick, will kind of be dictating the board state and the positioning, and you really don't have that much control over it because you're by yourself. You also have low flexibility because all your attacks can only come out of your hero, whereas someone like Sinbad has the porter, so if Sinbad is body blocked from the opposing hero and you can't get him to attack the enemy, you have the option of being able to use the porter and maybe throwing a momentous shift or a regroup or a buy fortune and fate on the enemy hero when Sinbad is unable to. But with Deadpool, you don't have that option because all your attacks are coming out of the same body. So it's easier for your opponent to kind of dictate who on their team you can attack or not. Just some things to keep in mind. In terms of deck composition, you have 30 unique cards, which is kind of Deadpool's whole gimmick. And that will lead us into the next segment of this video. If you remember from my Battle of Legends Volume 2 video, I did a nice tangent rant, and we're just going to bring that back because I really liked the soundbite. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the Highlander deck tangent rant. This portion of the video is brought to you by the 2021 Toyota Highlander. I really hope that joke lands. So anyway, a Highlander deck is something in card games where every card in your deck is unique. You only have one copy of each card. The best example I have of this from a different game is Hearthstone, where a couple years ago they released an expansion with the card called Reno Jackson, which kind of introduced this deck format into the game by giving you this big, powerful effect if your deck had no duplicates, because generally having no duplicates is bad because the consistency in your deck is just horrible. Obviously, in Unmatched, if you had like 15 copies of Larger Than Life, each with like a different name or a different effect or something like that, and 15 copies of like different versions of Skirmish, obviously those cards are really, really good, and if they were all at a busted power level, it wouldn't matter that you had just unique cards. But there are a lot of bad cards in this deck, so it's not like your cards are at an obnoxious strength to make up for the fact that you have no consistency. So the big issue with having no duplicates is that your draws in between games are just going to be absolutely random and inconsistent. You'll draw your opening hand of 5 cards, which is probably going to be different every single game, and then when you go to maneuver on your first turn, you have 25 different options of what you could draw instead of a normal deck that might have like 12. So when you play Deadpool, your games will go very differently depending on what cards you draw, and that is not necessarily an issue, but it means that you don't have a reliable game plan like some other heroes do. For example, Dracula, your whole game plan revolves around beast form and being able to set that up. But with Deadpool, you don't really have a direction, so you're kind of improvising on the fly based on what you draw, which could be good or bad depending on the power level of the different cards you draw. The other bad part about this is that there's only one copy of each card, so your good cards might be at the bottom of your deck, and you just might not draw them. You know, when Excalibur is at the bottom of King Arthur's deck, he's probably just going to lose that game. And if your best cards are at the bottom of your deck, there's only one copy of them, so that's where they could be. That really sucks for you. And on that note, you can only play each card once, albeit with Dumpster Diving Deadpool, you can play some cards twice, but in general, you're only mostly probably going to be playing each card once, which we've seen in other decks is kind of not that good. King Arthur, like I mentioned before, he only has one copy of Excalibur, and that's his best card by far in the deck. And the other really powerful cards in his deck, Lady of the Lake and his attack and Merlin's attack that both draw 2 cards, only having one copy of them leads to King Arthur having some pretty inconsistent games where he would really like to be able to use those cards more than once. Alice, her 3 best attacks, the Mushroom card, Frabulous Day, and Snickersnack, they're only one copy each, and that means that she won't reliably get that forced discard from Snickersnack every game, and just sometimes the damage from Frabulous Day just doesn't show up because you just don't draw those cards. And Sinbad and Bruce Lee have similar problems where they have 6 or 7 cards that are all very similar, but they each have a different effect, and depending on when you draw the specific one you're looking for can greatly impact your game. If Sinbad draws Voyage Home in his opening hand and he's playing against someone that has a bunch of discards, that can kind of suck if he loses that card randomly. In Bruce Lee, sometimes you get the Move Jeet and the Swap Jeet, the Swap Jeet and like the Draw Jeet, but the Momentous Shift Jeet and maybe the Cancel Jeet are at the bottom of your deck, and that kind of sucks. In addition, Bruce Lee has a bunch of schemes like One Inch Punch or Bring It On that there's only one copy of them, and we've seen how only having one copy of really important cards can be pretty devastating to certain decks. And this deck is just full of one copy cards, so that issue is probably going to happen to you a lot. So for this reason, the fact that you have no duplicates, this is the big reason why I wouldn't play Deadpool in a tournament, even if he was legal. There are a couple problem cards that we'll talk about later that basically mean as is, he can't be played in like an official tournament, but I wouldn't play him because he's just inconsistent. So thank you for listening to the Highlander deck tangent rant. I hope to go on more long tangent rants in the future. Deadpool's ability says after you attack, Deadpool recovers 1 health. There's also a little note at the bottom that says if your opponent's real name is Logan, all your attacks are +5. So obviously Deadpool is a great hero to pick if you're playing against Logan. Unfortunately, I don't think I know any Logans, but if your name is Logan, please leave a comment on this video so we can arrange a game. So this is very good healing. Most other decks, actually all other decks in the game, don't have ability-based healing. They have card-based healing, and that's just less reliable because it could get feinted or you could just not draw that card. For Deadpool, every time you attack, you recover 1 health. So this greatly helps offset your low max HP, because if you play fairly aggressively and maybe you're attacking once every turn, you're just gaining health. And even though you start with a low amount of health, if you're just able to constantly recover it and stay above like 5, 6, or maybe even get to 8 or 9 just for the whole game, it's going to make you a lot less vulnerable to getting hit with a big one-shot Forever Hide or Beast Form and just dying because you don't have enough health to block with. So this happens after you attack. It has the same timing as Robin Hood, whose ability says after you attack, the attacking fighter may move up to 2 spaces. So it happens when the cards are discarded. It doesn't happen during after combat, which means you can still be killed by an after combat effect, say on a counter punch or a Once Upon a Time. You heal after the combat is fully resolved. This is probably one of the strongest abilities in the game, but unfortunately the deck that it's attached to isn't super great. But definitely don't undervalue this ability just because the other parts of Deadpool are a little bit lacking. The first card is Underrated Superheroes, and this looks oddly familiar, so I'm just not going to talk about it in the interest of time. The next card is Gaze of Stone, which we've seen before in Medusa's deck, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over it again. I love the art though. The next card is Klunkin Heads, a 4-value attack with a boost value of 2. 1 copy, of course, but I'm not going to say that every time for each card because there's only 1 copy of every card. And it has an after combat effect that says if you won the combat, deal 3 damage to each other opposing fighter adjacent to the opposing fighter. So it says opposing fighter twice there, which can get a little bit messy, but basically the opposing fighter is the opposing fighter that you're in combat with, that you played this attack card against. And each other opposing fighter are the ones not involved in the combat. So if you are playing this attack against Robin Hood, and he has outlaws adjacent to him, Robin Hood, the opposing fighter is Robin Hood, and each other opposing fighter is the outlaws. And what this effect effectively does is if you win the combat, the other opposing fighters adjacent to the opposing fighter all take 3 damage, which is crazy. If you land just 3 damage on 1 target, that's a super powerful effect. So hitting more than 1 is just really, really good. Of course, hitting more than 1 opposing fighter with the effect means that they either have multiple sidekicks, in which case 3 damage is going to kill them because they only have 1 or 2 with Yanenga's archer's health. And the only other situation it could trigger more than once in right now is if you're playing against the Raptors and both of the other Raptors are behind the one you're attacking, in which case this card is probably going to win you the game. 4-value attacks are probably going to win combats. A lot of the great block cards in this game are at least 4, so it won't trigger against a skirmish or a leap away or anything like that. But there are a lot of 3-value block cards that this will hit over, in which case I'd say it's probably like at least 60% of the time going to trigger, which is really good. It also requires your opponent to position their fighters in a way that this would trigger, and some people might play around it, but it's only Klunkin Heads is only 1 in 30 of your cards, so maybe they will, maybe they won't. It depends on the opponent and it depends on the map. But this is a super strong card, and if you can get it to trigger, you're going to be very, very happy about that. Because it's great for when your opponent tries to body block their hero away from you with a sidekick, because you can play this card against their sidekick and they probably won't throw out a super good block card because it's just their sidekick. And if you win the combat, you'll deal 3 damage to their hero if they're adjacent. That's like the best case scenario, and it's really good if that happens. The next card is Merc for Hire. It is a 5-value attack with a boost value of 1, and it says after combat, deal 1 damage to the opposing fighter if you own the Deadpool Unmatched set. So this is a card that rewards you for collecting sets and buying them and not being a cheapskate that plays with other people's board games. It also means there is an incentive to buy this so that even if you're not playing with your own Deadpool set, you own the Deadpool set somewhere and it'll trigger for you. Of course, I don't know if this set is out of print by the time that I am recording this, so oh well. It'll be on eBay in a couple of months for like $500, so it'll be a vastly more expensive effect to buy at that point. 5-value attacks are really good, and this one has text, so it's just better than a blank 5, which is good because you only have a couple of high-value attacks. This is one of them, and you have to make the most out of this, and even a single point of damage could help turn the tide. It's essentially a 6-value attack, but it's better against high-value block cards like maybe War King or Duality of Man that would block the entirety of the value, but they'll still take a damage from the after combat effect. But it's a little bit worse against cancel effects because this only does 3 damage over a feint instead of 4 that like an actual printed value of 6 would do. So this is a really good card if you're playing with the set, or if you're playing and you own a set. For example, I play this game with my brother a lot, and when he plays as Deadpool, the effect doesn't trigger for him because I'm the one that bought it and owns it. So it's essentially a blank 5 for him, but it's a 5 with text for me. and the difference isn't too big between those, but it's just an extra point of damage is always nice. The next card is Excuse Me While I Grow Some Limbs. Maybe you could call it Deadpool 007, but I like that name a little bit better because it's funny. It's a 3 value attack with a boost value of 1, and it says after combat, your opponent discards a card. If they won the combat, they discard 2 instead. So this card reminds me a lot of Clutching Claws, which is a 3 value versatile that the Harpies have from Medusa's deck that just says after combat, your opponent discards a card. That card is really good on defense because it means that when your opponent wants to kill a Harpy, they basically have to spend 2 cards to do that. And generally, choice discards are better when you're playing it on a defense card, so it's your opponent's turn when the discard happens, because that means they have less time to react to the fact that they have 1 less card in their hand, whereas because you are attacking with this card, for one, it's more likely to get feinted, because feint is primarily used on defense. But also, that means, let's say you're attacking second action, and your opponent discards a card. Now they actually have time to react, and instead they could double maneuver on their turn to get their hand size back. Whereas with a card like Clutching Claws, they attacked you, let's say it was their second action, and then they have to discard a card, and now it's your turn, and they're down a card that they probably didn't expect to lose. So that doesn't mean this card is bad necessarily. I just like choice discards better when it's your opponent's turn. And that being said, choice discards aren't even that strong. They're just more annoying because most of the time your opponent will probably have like a regroup or something in their hand that they don't mind ditching, but it's really good for punishing low hand sizes, especially against someone like Bloody Mary that maybe only has 3 or 4 cards in their hand at any given time, and probably more likely that they're holding something a little bit more important at a low hand size, especially if you win the combat, because then they discard 2 cards, and that's when it can get from annoying to an actually strong effect. Although the problem is you're probably not going to win the combat with a 3 value attack for the same reason that no contest expecteth doesn't really trigger that often, just because 3 value attacks aren't necessarily the best thing for winning combats. This is, we're going to make the connection to Medusa again. This is actually a little bit better than I'm making it seem, because while Deadpool doesn't have a lot of card draw, a card like this, where your opponent has to discard a card, helps even the card advantage disparity, because instead of you drawing a card, your opponent loses a card, which is almost the same thing. So it's definitely still a good attack because it's annoying and it helps you a little bit more than what would appear, but it's, again, not super great at only a value 3. The next card is Faculty, or Scott Mers. I think that's supposed to say Scott Summers. I don't know who that is. I'm not familiar with Marvel lore, but anyways, it's a 3 value attack with a boost value of 2, and it says you may play this card as a ranged attack. So one thing I want to note is that this card works a lot like What Big Ears You Have from Little Red's deck, where the effect can't be canceled because it doesn't have like a combat timing trigger on it. The effect, essentially, the timing is before combat. Like, the effect triggers as you play the card, so even if it gets canceled, the combat still happens, because this card says you may play this as a ranged attack. Deadpool is a melee hero, so obviously if you're throwing an attack out from 2 spaces away from your opponent and they play a feint, the attack still goes through. And it is an interesting effect. It's the only card in the deck that works like this. So when you play it and you're not adjacent to your opponent, this is the only option. So they'll know exactly what it is. And for that reason, I don't actually think you should play this from ranged just because you can. It's a 3 value attack, which isn't good. It essentially has no effect because like nothing happens during or after the combat to give you any other value or advantage. It's just a blank 3 after you play it from range, and that's pretty easy for your opponent to block, and because it's predictable, you just have almost no advantage in the actual combat. There are a few situations where it might be useful to play from range, though. If your opponent is body blocking you with a sidekick, it might be useful to play this from range so you can actually land a hit on them, because maybe your opponent's hero doesn't have anything they can block with, which is why they threw the sidekick out. If you have to boost your maneuver to be able to attack normally, whereas you could just normal maneuver and then throw this out, that saves you a card, so it might be worth it. If you want to maintain your kiting with advantage, meaning you don't want to end your turn next to your opponent, you can throw this card out to avoid potentially getting double attacked, because you're attacking from range and you're not adjacent to them. Although that really only works from against melee heroes, because if you're in the same zone as a ranged hero and you end your turn there, they could just double attack you anyways. And of course, this heals you after you play it. So if you just want to heal without getting super close to your opponent, it's a nice way to do that, because the heal is not cancelable because it's not a card effect. It just works on your ability. So besides those reasons, I would just play this as a normal melee attack, just because your opponent knows exactly what it is if you're playing it from ranged, and you won't really surprise them at all with this, and it won't really do that much if your opponent actually blocks. But there are, again, a few niche scenarios where I would actually use the ability to play this from ranged and surprise my opponent. But overall, not a super useful card, and most of the time it's just going to end up being a blank 3, like a bait attack essentially. The next card is 3 of Hearts. It's a 3 value attack with a boost value of 4, and it says after combat, draw 1 card. This is very similar to Snipe from Medusa's deck, except that is a versatile. 3 value attacks aren't very good, as we've seen. Both Faculty and Excuse Me While I Grow Some Limbs are interesting cards, but certainly not anything super flashy. And this is, I don't want to say a boring card, but it's just an attack that draws you a card. Card draw is very important for Deadpool because he doesn't really have that much, and block cards are kind of an issue for him, as we've discussed earlier. So any card draw you can get is really good, and this is nice because you attack with it, and then after combat you draw a card, so your hand size is the same as when you initiated the attack. It also has a high boost value, which might come into play with other card synergies, but it's also it's a 4 value boost. You could move 6 spaces with a single maneuver. That's a lot of spaces, especially for a generally slow character. But essentially this card acts as a regroup, where it's basically a bait attack that replaces itself after you play it, and maybe you deal a single damage with it, and that's generally the best case scenario I see for this card. The next playing card looking card is Ace of Spades. Maybe you call this exploding card, but the other card was called 3 of Hearts, so I'm gonna be consistent and call this Ace of Spades. It's a 1 value attack with a boost value of 4, and it says during combat, if you made an exploding noise when you revealed this card, the value of this card is 4. So we're getting a little silly here, but essentially you're gonna make exploding noises when you flip over the card, and it's gonna be a 4. So basically it's a 4 value attack with no text, except against cancel effects. It does absolutely nothing. The other thing is you shouldn't forget to make the noise. When you play your attack card face down, sometimes your opponent takes a while to think about what they're going to block with. And I know this has happened to me a bunch, where I just forget what attack card I put down. If you forget to make the noise, the effect doesn't go through. In which case it's just a 1 value attack that does absolutely nothing. So don't forget to make the noise. 4 value attacks are decent. They're probably going to deal you a damage or 2, because most of the black cards in this game are not 4 value, although the good ones are. And again, it has a high boost value, so you could move 6 spaces in a single maneuver, which is good, and it also synergizes with some other cards we're going to talk about. So overall, this is a decent card, and it's a funny card. It's probably in my top 3 favorite cards from this deck, just because What counts as an exploding noise, by the way? I'd like to know. That's probably something you and your opponent can argue about when you're playing this game. The next card is Cha-Ching. It's a 1 value attack with a boost value of 3, and it says, during combat, you may boost this card. So this card is essentially just like Second Shot, where during combat you can boost this card, except this has a starting value of 1 instead of 2, which compared to Medusa's Second Shot, which has a starting value of 3, just makes you wonder why. You know, it makes you wonder. So generally, having a lower printed value just means you'll do 1 less damage, but it also means it's good against What a Big Mouth You Have and Equal of Grendel, which both deal damage back to you based on the printed value of your card. So this is very good about minimizing the damage you take from that, and means you can attack with a pretty strong attack when Red has a Pelt in the basket or Beowulf has at least 2 rage. So on the other cards in your deck, you have 4 value boosts on Gaze of Stone, Ace of Spades, 3 of Hearts, and another card we haven't seen called Nope Mine. And you have 1 6 value boost on a card called Push to Teleport. So those are the 5 cards I would probably use when playing this card to maximize the amount of damage you can use. And that's either going to end up as a 5 value attack, which is pretty good, or a 7 value attack, which is really good. Ideally, you go for the 7, but again, this is 1 card, and Push to Teleport is another card, and sometimes you just won't draw them at the same time. So sometimes you might have to settle for the 5 value boost attack, which isn't horrible, but when you could do 7, you know, it's like, why even bother? The other thing that is good about this card is the fact that during combat, you can decide whether or not to boost the card, and your effect will happen after the defender's effect. So you'll know exactly what value your opponent's card will be when you're deciding whether or not to boost. And if they played like a War King or a Duality of Man, and they have a 6 or 7 value block card, you can hold off on boosting, and even though you lose the combo potential, it's still, you don't waste a boost card to essentially deal only 1 or 2 damage. I would try to hit at least 3 if you're going for the Push to Teleport combo, just because only dealing 1 damage with 2 cards isn't that great. So this is a very strong card, and if your opponent plays a pretty bad block card, you can really punish them if you're holding the right boost card. The next card is Robert's Pouch Emporium. Why did I say Robert? Rob's Pouch Emporium. All right, baked goods, bring it together. Compose yourself. Robert's Pouch Emporium. Okay, come on. People are waiting on you. This video is long enough. The next card is Rob's Pouch Emporium. It's a 4 value attack. It has a boost value of 1. And it says, after combat, move the opposing fighter 1 space. Just 1. Whew, sorry about that, folks. This is essentially a skirmish that you can only use to attack with, and 4 value attacks are pretty good for reasons that I've said at least twice this video. Now, the effect is interesting because it moves the opposing fighter 1 space. So it does create separation between you and the enemy after combat, which is essentially what skirmish does. And this is good for setting up kiting with advantage, meaning that you're not ending your turn next to your opponent, because especially against melee heroes. You don't want to give them double attacks, especially as a character that doesn't have a lot of health or a lot of good blocks. It could also move ranged characters out of their zone to prevent them from double attacking you, but that's a little bit more situational depending on the positioning. And similarly, it has some niche map uses, like you could push your opponent through a secret passage or down into the raptor paddock, which would actually be really good. So you can actually use this card to set up a pin in a rare circumstance, which would be, I don't even know if that would be helpful for Deadpool, because I don't think you would want to let your opponent attack you that often. Anyways, it's a very interesting card. It's very useful for when you don't want your opponent to double attack you, which is all the time. So it's just great. We're on to defense cards now. We have the card Passwords, which I guess could also be called I've Been Hacked, but Passwords is just short, sweet, and to the point. It's a 5 value block card with a boost value of 1, and it says after combat, your opponent looks at your hand and chooses a card for you to discard. So 5 value blocks aren't really that common. One exists in Willow's deck, I think it's called Meditation, and now one exists in Sun Wukong's deck, Turtle form or Tortoise form. So this is one of 3. It's like a unicorn. It's so rare, so you just gotta marvel at it when you actually see it. And it's really good value blocking, because 5 value blocks, you're probably gonna block a lot of damage, especially against a high value attack like Larger Than Life. This only deals 1 damage to you, which is really good. It's not that great against cards like Once Upon a Time, which have their damage built into an after combat effect. So that would deal 3 damage to you if you played this card. So you gotta try to line this up when you think your opponent is gonna play a big value attack and not something that depends on the effect. It's also just good because you only have 10 health, so being able to block 5 damage is just really good for helping you stay alive. It does come at a cost though, because your opponent basically gets a free insight or eliminate the impossible effect on you, where they get to look at your hand and discard a card from it, which is potentially pretty bad if you're holding some other important things. And that kind of means that you're using 2 cards to block your opponent's attack, and one of the cards is something that your opponent gets to pick, and if they pick your Cha-Ching, you can't boost to a 7 anymore. So that kind of sucks. So I would try to avoid playing this when you have a really good card in your hand, because as we've seen, you have some pretty mediocre cards, and if your opponent takes one from you, you don't really feel that bad. But if they take a really good card from you, that sucks. Now, they're probably also going to try to take a block card from you, because that is a weakness we have identified for Deadpool. So if you're only holding 1 other block card in your hand, it might just be better to play that instead, so that your opponent doesn't take that from you, in addition to you playing the Passwords, and now they know that you don't have any blocks in your hand. And if their attack was their first action, that could just end the game if they get to land a big undefended swing on you for their second action. So this is a very powerful card for both you and your opponent, but you have to really think about the timing of when you play it, in both what you're going to block and what cards in your hand that you're going to lose. The next card is Hellfire Club. It is a 3 value block card with a boost value of 2, and it says after combat, recover 2 health. Then, if you are at full health, take 2 damage. So 3 value block cards aren't the best, but the after combat effect that lets you recover 2 health essentially makes this a value 5, which is very good. Of course, it says if you are at full health, after you recover 2 health, you take 2 damage, so it essentially does nothing. So don't play this card if you are at 8 or more health, just because if your opponent plays a regroup or something like that, and you don't take any damage over the 3 value block you played, you'll recover 2 health, and then you'll just take 2 damage. Why would you do that? That's even worse if you're at 9 health You don't take any damage from the combat. You recover 2 health, but you can only recover 1 because your max health is 10. And then you take 2 damage and you go down to 8. Just don't. Just don't. Don't. Come on. Don't be silly. They have an amazing buffet, but you don't need to go when you're at 8 health, okay? All right? You got that? Are you listening? Are you listening to me? The next card is Transit Card. I mean, that's better than my driver's license photo. So it's a 2-value block card with a boost value of 1, and it says, after combat, move to any space in your zone. I'm pretty sure the wording on this card should be place Deadpool in any space in his zone, just because move to any space, the word there being move, can be a little problematic based on how you want to interpret it. So we're going to go with the interpretation that it lets you place your hero in any space in the zone that you're currently in, regardless of movement restrictions or things like that. So this is kind of like the Angel card, Haunted by the Faces, that lets you move anywhere after combat. It's not great at value blocking because it's only a 2-value block card, which kind of hurts for a character that has a starting health of 10. But the value is actually really good against ranged fighters because you can block with this. And if it's their second action, they're attacking you, you can move adjacent to them because if they're attacking you, they're in the same zone as you. That's how ranged fighters work. And this lets you just go right next to them, so you start your turn there, and you can potentially double attack them or something like that. In that sense, you should use this card just like you use Trick of the Light, I believe, from Bloody Mary's deck. It's a similar use as that card. But it also is good for breaking combos and double attacks from the Raptors or Bruce Lee, for example, because let's say you're surrounded by all 3 Raptors, they attack you. Yeah, maybe they play a 7-value Eviscerate, but you play this card, and then you get to move to any space in your zone, and you get out of that pin after the combat. And, of course, if Bruce Lee plays a Jeet against you, he'll gain an action, but he won't be next to you anymore, so he can't immediately attack you. So this card is bad, but it does have some niche uses against ranged heroes and other degenerate people that want to kill you pretty quickly. The next card is Super Feint. It's a 4-value versatile card with a boost value of 2, and it says, this card can't be canceled. Immediately, cancel all effects on your opponent's card. After combat, draw 1 card. Wow. I think, just like Deadpool's ability, this is super strong, but the fact that it's attached to a subpar deck means it won't get the recognition it deserves. So think about Feint. It's one of the best cards in the game because it cancels opposing effects, which can save you a lot of health. The problem with Feint is that it only blocks 2 damage. So against bigger value things, like Forever Hide, that starts at a 5, you take 3 damage. And it's bad if you get the mind game wrong and you take an Excalibur to the face for 4 damage. So this blocks 2 more damage for Feint for a total of 4. So now, Forever Hide only deals you 1 damage, and Excalibur, Larger Than Life, only deals you 2 damage. That's actually insane. If this card was in any other deck, I think people would understand how truly impactful it is. It's just the fact that it's in Deadpool's deck, which isn't super great to begin with. So the fact that this card can't be canceled doesn't really matter. It just guarantees the fact that you'll draw a card, so your after combat effect will never be canceled. And I'm pretty much going to say you're going to use this on defense because you don't really want to waste a good effect and a good value like this on offense. So your Feint effect, your immediately effect, will trigger first if you're playing this on defense. So the fact that it can't be canceled doesn't really matter, but it's just the whole aesthetic of this card is perfect because Deadpool wanted to give him an overpowered or a super Feint, and you know, you're not going to cancel Deadpool's super Feint. And the fact that the card draw is guaranteed is really good because, as we've discussed, card draw is important for Deadpool because he doesn't have a lot and he needs draw to be able to block. So the fact that you'll probably play this on defense and replace itself in your hand is really good, especially against characters with bonus attacks or action gains that want to attack you multiple times and run you out of block cards on the same turn. This maybe will draw you a block card and you can hold off their barrage a block or two longer. Nice. So essentially this card is like Exploit, which is a 4-value versatile that draws you a card, but it has a Feint effect attached to it, which is surprisingly good. It's like a State Farm commercial. Surprisingly great rates, surprisingly great super Feint. I really love this card. This is one of the best cards in the deck, and it should be held in higher esteem than it is, in my opinion. The next card is Push to Teleport, which is a big metal button taped to a playing card. Nice. It's a 2-value versatile with a boost value of 6 and an after combat effect that says draw 1 card. I believe this is the highest boost value in the game. I don't even know if there's 5s. It's just, wow, that is a big boost value. So this is a pretty weak attack or block because it only deals 2 damage. You're probably not going to deal any damage if your opponent blocks this attack. And as a block, only blocking 2 damage isn't really that much, but it's useful in a pinch. The fact that the after combat effect draws you a card is again important for reasons that I've stressed several times throughout this video, but I think this card is better used as a utility card for boosting. You can either boost Cha-Ching to make it a 7, and this is the 1 card in the deck that can get that high. The next highest boost values are 4, so Cha-Ching would only be a 5, which, as we've discussed, isn't bad, but knowing that you could get it to a 7 means that you probably subconsciously want to only get it to a 7. So this is the combo piece for that card. But also you could boost your maneuver and move 8 spaces, which is so many spaces. You could probably reach anywhere on any map from any space using this as a boost. Of course, that's probably not true. And someone in the comments is going to be like, yeah, but on the bronze, no. Well, I'm making a generalization. Let's pretend I'm right. 8 spaces is a lot to move. That's late game Sinbad levels of movement. But you probably know that 8 is a lot bigger than 2 or 3. The one downside this card has is against ambushes. That will likely be an 8-value attack if they pull this card. And Sherlock, with his Confirmed Suspicion, can deal 6 damage to you, which is 60% of your maximum health. Both of those situations are absolutely horrible for you. So against any character that has Ambush and Sherlock, you pretty much have to get this card out of your hand ASAP as possible, because if the worst case scenario happens, you are screwed. So this is a really interesting card. I like how absolutely useful it is. And it's just like, imagine whenever you boost this as a maneuver, you're literally like teleporting across the map. That's just funny. Really neat card. The next card is I Always Get the Last Word. It is a 3-value versatile with a boost value of 1, and it says, after combat, if you attacked, deal 1 damage to the opposing fighter. So as an attack, it's basically a guaranteed 1 damage, because the after combat effect will go through if it's not canceled, but if it is canceled, probably with a feint, it deals 1 damage with the value. Of course, that doesn't work over, it's just your imagination from Bigfoot's deck, but currently I believe all the multi-sidekick decks don't have any sort of canceling that's higher than 2. So against InGen Workers and Dracula's Sisters and Harpies and Robin Hood's Outlaws, it's basically going to kill them, which is pretty good. The problem is, this is one of your 15 cards you can block with, and if you're attacking with it, that brings your number down to 14. And if you're doing other things, like using Push to Teleport as a boost card, that brings the number down to 13. So I really don't think you can afford to play this as an attack most of the time. I think you're going to have to use it as a blank 3 on defense, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but for the purposes of this deck, that is actually decent, since you have a bunch of 2-value blocks that don't really do anything else. So a 3 value block that doesn't do anything else seems a lot better compared to those. I think the use for this as an attack to basically guarantee 1 damage is nice. It's nice that that exists, but I don't think you can afford to use it as an attack. I think you have to save it for defense. And if you look carefully, this is actually Snark from Robin Hood's deck. It's kind of hard to tell, but you can see it through the notebook paper on the thing. The next card is, and for my next move, a 2 value versatile with a boost value of 1, and it says, after combat, deal 2 damage to the opposing fighter, or move your fighter up to 3 spaces. This card has a choice on it, and I love cards with choices just because they provide you with an interesting decision to make at some point during the match, and you have to figure out the best way to utilize it. Cards like Looking Glass and Golden Drinking Horn and Call for Backup especially are just other cards with choices, along with Never Leave the Path from Little Red's deck, and it's just always a blast to try to figure out how to best use them. The value part of this card is not very good because it's only 2, which doesn't really do that much as an attack or a block, but because it is versatile and you have a relatively low amount of block cards in this deck, you're probably going to have to use it on defense. But the effect portion of this card really makes up for anything that the value lacks, even though you will probably take 2 damage depending on what card your opponent played as an attack. The first effect you can choose is deal 2 damage to the opposing fighter. This reminds me a lot of Point Blank from Yanenga's deck, except this doesn't have an adjacency requirement, so it'll still work if you're, let's say, being attacked by a ranged fighter that isn't adjacent to you for the combat. I think this is a very powerful effect. We've seen how Counterpunch in Sherlock Holmes' deck is just very annoying to play against because 2 damage actually hurts a little bit more than it seems like it does, because you say it's only 2 damage, but it's actually a lot. And that's just kind of like a game feel thing. The number doesn't seem that big, but it's actually pretty substantial. I think this effect is probably best used when you are actually like ahead on life, although I don't actually know when that would come up because your health total is relatively low, but maybe when you have like the momentum in the game, or your hand size is pretty big, or you have some sort of advantage over your opponent, I think just dealing them 2 damage is a great way to kind of keep pressure on them and maintain the lead. And you're probably going to use this against melee fighters a lot because the other effect isn't as good against them. That effect being move your fighter up to 3 spaces. I really like this against ranged heroes because, again, when they're attacking you from range and you're not right next to them, you can use this after combat and maybe end right next to them after the effect, because 3 spaces is a pretty decent amount to move. It's more spaces than you can normally move during a maneuver, and if you position yourself maybe in the middle of a big zone when you have this card in your hand, you can guarantee that you'll be able to reach the opposing ranged fighter with the 3 spaces you can move. This also breaks combos from action gainers like Bruce Lee and the Raptors that want to just sit there and attack you 7 times on their turn. If you can move away from their fighter, the action they gain after they attack you has to be used to maneuver if they want to attack you again, and if it was their last action and they only gained 1, they probably won't be able to attack you again on their turn, which is great. So I think the damage effect is best used against melee fighters, and the spaces effect is best used against ranged fighters to maybe set up some double attacks. So while this card didn't really look like anything special at first, the effects are both very powerful and very flexible, and they really help you depending on which opponent you have in your specific matchup. The next card is Nope Mine, a 3 value versatile with a boost value of 4, and it says after combat, look at your opponent's hand, recover 1 health. This is a very powerful effect, and you definitely do not want it to get feinted, and your opponent is probably more likely to play feints on defense than they are on offense attacking you, so I would really not ever attack with this card just because you wouldn't want to risk it. And it's a 3 value block card, so you're probably going to want to block with it because 3 value blocks aren't too shabby. That's actually a pretty good value to block with. The fact that it also recovers you 1 health after combat essentially means that it blocks 4 damage, because if your opponent attacks you with a 4 value attack, you won't take any damage from the combat after you heal. And it's even better than just a 4 value block, because if your opponent attacks with something that is 3 or less, you actually gain a health, like the excess value from your block converts to health, which is very good. Obviously, that's just a different way of thinking about the card. It doesn't actually work like that, but essentially it blocks 4 damage, and if you don't take 4 damage, you get 1 health as a nice little extra bonus. The effect that lets you look at your opponent's hand is actually very, very good for Deadpool. Normally, I don't think this effect is like super game breaking or anything, but Deadpool especially really benefits from knowing which attacks are in his opponent's hands. You also have a card called Holy Mackerel, which its effect is a lot better when you actually know your opponent's hand, and we'll get to that in a little bit. In niche scenarios, you might want to attack with this card so that you can heal for 2 with the after combat effect and your ability, but I'm not entirely sure how that would be better than just blocking 3. But maybe in a pinch, if you know your opponent has some auto damage coming up and you really need to get your health up, this could be a nice way to increase it by more than 1. It also has a high boost if you want to put it into Cha-Ching for a 5 value attack, or if you want to move 6 spaces. So this is a very good block card, and it is one of the best in your deck, but I would really only use it when you have Holy Mackerel in your hand to try to get the wombo combo, if you will. However, this is 1 card, that's 1 card, and maybe you just don't draw them at the same time, which in that case, it's probably just still a fine option to play. The next card is Gimme Gimme Chimichanga. What is this deck, man? It's a 3 value versatile with a boost value of 1, and it says after combat, draw a card, recover 1 health. This card is very similar to the last card, except the only difference is the boost value is different, and you draw a card instead of looking at your opponent's hand. So a lot of things I talked about with Note Mine are going to translate to this card. It's a versatile, but you're probably going to play it on defense for many reasons that I've stressed so far this video. It also recovers you 1 health, so it's essentially like blocking for 4 damage. But the card draw is very important for Deadpool because you want to draw more blocks, and you don't really have a lot of cards that draw you more cards. So the fact that you'll play this on defense and it will replace itself in your hand size won't go down after you play this card, is very, very good. And again, you can heal for 2 if you attack with this card combined with your ability. But again, there's only a couple situations where you'd want to do that instead of just blocking 3 damage. So overall, this card isn't as good as Note Mine, but the card draw is good if you need it. The health is always good, and it blocks for 3, which is really good for Deadpool. So you can use this a lot more liberally than Note Mine because you don't have to hold on to it for a specific combo piece or a certain situation like that. This card is just pretty much always good when you play it. The next card is Feint, but not that faint. It's a scheme with a boost value of 2, and it says, tip your figure over, make a fainting noise, recover 2 health, reset your figure. This card might trigger the same argument as Ace of Spades, where you and your opponent argue over if the noise you made is actually a fainting noise or an exploding noise. Absolute nonsense. Essentially, this card recovers 2 health, and that's it. There's a lot of other shenanigans that go on, but that don't really, it doesn't impact the game. It doesn't really matter. And just healing for 2 as a scheme maybe wouldn't be that good in other decks, but for Deadpool, with his low HP, that is really good. This essentially recovers 20% of your maximum health. 2 health, we talked about with and for my next move, how 2 damage is actually like a very decent amount of damage. On the opposite side of that spectrum, 2 health is a lot of health to recover. It also acts as an action pass, meaning it's a scheme that doesn't give you an action or draw you a card, so it's great for avoiding overdraw and giving initiative back to your opponent. So let's say you reach at 7 cards, but it's your turn. Normally, the way that actions go, it would dictate that you would have to maneuver in and attack to avoid overdrawing, but you can maneuver and go up to 8 cards and then play this, and you're still at 7, and now your opponent has the initiative and they're incentivized to come in and attack you so that they don't overdraw. So it kind of acts like Calming Research from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde's deck in that sense. And sometimes when you play Calming Research, you draw 0 cards, in which case it does the exact same thing as this card, which means this card is very solid because Calming Research is very solid. And yeah, you can't draw cards with this card, but recovering 2 health is still very good for this character. And overall, this is a very good way to keep yourself alive, even though it's not a block card. The next card is Holy Mackerel. Sorry, it has an exclamation point. Let me say that again. Holy Mackerel! It's a scheme with a boost value of 2, and it says, guess the name of a card in your opponent's hand. Your opponent must discard all cards with that name. Otherwise, they say go fish, and you draw a card. So this card is a lot like Confirm Suspicion, except your opponent doesn't take damage, but you can make them discard multiple cards. I will say the name of the card you guess, though, has to be specific. You can't, if you're playing against Bruce Lee or Sinbad, for example, you can't just say Jeet Kune Do or Voyage, respectively. You have to say Voyage to the land of the island that was a whale, or Jeet Kune Do wrist lock. Like, it has to be a specific card. It doesn't just like lump all those cards together, if that makes sense. So in that sense, this card is a lot more useful in matchups where your opponent has multiple copies of their best card. Say like Robin Hood, who has 3 copies of Hunter's Eye and 4 copies of Highway Robbery, compared to someone like King Arthur, who has 1 copy of Excalibur, 1 copy of Lady of the Lake, and 1 copy of Aid the Chosen One, and Holy Grail, and Aid of Morgana. So against opponents like Sinbad or Bruce Lee or King Arthur or Alice, where they have just 1 copy of really good cards, it's a lot less useful, because even if your guess does hit on the card that you named, you're only discarding 1 card maximum, where if you're playing against Bigfoot, he has 3 copies of most of his cards, and just anything that you could get multiple copies of would be really good to get rid of. This card is the one that synergizes with Nope Mine, because if you're playing it when you know your opponent's hand, and you basically you're picking which card you want them to discard, it's a lot better than just blindly guessing, especially if you're trying to go for multiple copies. So I would really only play this card after I've played Nope Mine, except like I mentioned for Nope Mine, that scenario just might not come up because there's only 1 copy of this card, there's 1 copy of that card, and maybe you just don't draw them at the same time. So if you don't draw them, I guess I would just go for the highest probability card that they're holding multiple copies of, or their best card. And if those things overlap, that's really great. Because if you don't guess a card that they're holding in their hand, you just draw a card, and playing a scheme that just draws a card, like, literally does nothing. You just replace the card in your hand and lose an action. Not that good, but I guess you also would know that your opponent doesn't have that specific card in their hand, which I guess is better than nothing. This card is the main problem child of this deck for why Deadpool is banned from tournaments, because there's no actual way to confirm whether or not your opponent is telling the truth. If you guess larger than life and Bigfoot says, no, I don't have that card in my hand, go fish. There's no like built-in way for Bigfoot to prove that he doesn't have it. Because take Confirmed Suspicion, for example. If you guess something that your opponent doesn't have, they show you their hand so that you know they were telling the truth. But with this card, potentially your opponent could lie about it. And my solution to that is don't play games with cheaters. Yeah, if there's someone that you suspect of cheating, get new friends. So overall, this is a very powerful card, and if you can get rid of multiple cards, that's great just from a value standpoint, and if you can get rid of your opponent's best card, that's also good. It's just a semi-forced discard, and if you play it when you actually know your opponent's hand, you'll get a lot more mileage out of it. This next section is... we're going to call it the meta effect speedrun, because these are all the cards with meta effects that are mostly nonsense and highly subjective. So to quote the great Rodney Smith, I'll leave you to discover them on your own. That basically just means you and your opponent can argue and debate over if soup counts as food or something like that, or if shorts are pants, and these cards, let's just get into it. Wanna bet? This is a low value attack that does nothing. Eat me. This is a low value block that does nothing. I'm not wearing pants. This might be a 5. Hopefully you use it to block. Call me. This might be a 4. Hopefully you use it to block. Chimichanga break. This might be a 5. Hopefully you use it to block. Sweet. What does yellowish even mean? We now move on to the basic cards, which there's only one of. It is Feint, the normal Feint with an E. So combined with your super Feint, you have 2 cancels in this deck akin to Little Red with her big eyes, or Bloody Mary, who just has 2 normal Feints. So effects-based decks like Little Red and Sinbad are probably going to have a field day against you because you have a relatively low amount of cancels and no consistent card draw to find them. So this is kind of a weakness for you, but you do have ways to recycle cards, and you're probably going to want to recycle your cancels, so we'll get to that shortly. Feint only being a 2-value block card kind of hurts for Deadpool because he has relatively low amount of health. So whenever you play this card, yes, you are canceling your opponent's card effect, but you're also not blocking that much damage. And if you get to a low enough health total, this card just might be unplayable because it might just kill you even if you cancel the opponent's Forever Hide or Beast Form, for example. So that kind of is Deadpool's weakness, health, because it's low. So you kind of have to make sure that even if you're canceling your opponent's card effect, that you're not just losing a bunch of health and dying anyways. You really have to actually cancel something useful on your opponent's card, and if you just play this against a larger than life, you're probably going to lose. Yikes. So I have a pair of cards that I wanted to talk about last after talking about every other card, because these kind of depend on other cards to actually do something. The first is Timeout. It's a 0-value versatile with a boost value of 3, and it says, immediately call timeout. Look through your deck and pick a card you could play. Discard this card and play that one instead. So this is a very flexible effect that kind of helps with the inconsistency of your deck and the low amount of card draw, because even if there's a card buried in your deck that you're not drawing, you still have a way to play it kind of with this card. That being said, it only works with cards in your deck. It does not work with discarded cards or cards that you've already played. So you kind of can always know what options you have by just looking through your discard pile and seeing which cards aren't there, because you know if you haven't played a card yet, it's still in your deck and you could use Timeout to try to get it. So in that sense, it's better to use this card early in the game so that you have more options while your deck is still rather plump. If this card is one of the last 3 cards in your deck, yeah, that sucks because it probably won't do anything super crazy that you want it to. This is a versatile card, so you can play it on defense. I think maybe like 3/4 of the time you want to play this on defense, and the other 1/4 of the time you can play it on offense, and we'll talk about it in a second. But I think it's a good option on defense again, because Deadpool has some good block cards and he has some bad block cards, and you really don't want to waste your good block cards on bait attacks from your opponent. So you can play Timeout when you don't know what card your opponent played, so that after you flip over both of your cards and you see what attack was played, you can go through your deck and either get a good block card from your deck to block with, or just get one of the crap blocks in your deck, and you actually feel good about that because you didn't waste a good block card on your opponent's bait attack, and you got a crap card out of your deck so that now later you don't draw it. The other reason why I would play this on defense is because it has an immediately effect, and whenever the timing of two effects is tied, the defender's resolved first, which means this can't be canceled if your opponent attacks with a feint. If you attack with this card into a feint, it'll actually get canceled and not do anything, which is one of the reasons why I wouldn't really attack with this card. But it also is very useful for just like quick scoping your opponent. If they don't block or they block with something bad, you could find a huge attack in your deck and punish them. If they block with a regroup, you could find Gaze of Stone and deal 9 damage to them, or just get underrated superheroes out and deal 5 damage to them. So it's a great way to potentially punish people. And I think sometimes it might be a little risky going for the punish versus just getting a safe option on defense, but still that potential is there, and I wouldn't actually discount that because sniping someone with a Gaze of Stone could just win you the game. The thing is, though, you have to replace timeout. It's not a may. It says look through your deck and pick a card you could play, discard this one. It's mandatory. It's not optional. So you're always using 2 cards when you play this card. So in that sense, it's a little deceptive as a block card because you're using 2 cards to block one of your opponent's attacks. And that actually kind of brings down the total amount of cards you can block with to 14. So knowing that, it's actually a lot riskier to attack with the other versatiles in your deck just because the number is a lot lower than you think. So overall, this is a very powerful early option, and it's very flexible and it's very powerful. And the last card is Dumpster Diving Deadpool. It's a scheme with a boost value of 1, and it says shuffle 5 cards from your discard pile into your deck. Recover 1 health. This is one of the most powerful cards in the game. It reminds me a lot of Super Feint in a way because it's a card that in any other deck would just be insane, but because the deck it's attached to isn't that great, it probably gets underrated a little bit. But really, think about what this does. In Unmatched, your deck is the game timer because when your deck runs out, you're going to die relatively quickly. This delays your deck running out by essentially 3 turns because it takes an action to play this card. That's an action that you're not maneuvering on and drawing a card. And then it shuffles 5 cards from your discard pile back into your deck. So that's 5 more maneuvers, which is in total 6 actions. So that's a long time to delay the game by. And just not even thinking about exhaustion, it shuffles 5 cards that you've already played back into your deck. You're getting 5 good cards back into your deck to play again. So this really helps with the inconsistency of Deadpool because it lets you play your best options twice. So let's talk about what cards you should shuffle back into your deck. And there's a couple options that you have. You could shuffle in your really good attacks like underrated superheroes, Klunkin Heads, Gaze of Stone, and Merc for Hire. Those will all probably do a lot of damage, and that's really good when you know your opponent doesn't really have a lot of good value blocking and you just want to close out the game quickly by just throwing your big attacks back at them. You can also get the Cha-Ching and Push to Teleport combo to use 2 cards to boost up to a 7 in 1 attack. That could potentially deal a lot of damage. As I mentioned, you want to shuffle back in your cancels in certain matchups, so Super Feint and Feint are great to have again. You also have a bunch of 5 value blocks like Passwords and the Pants and Food on the Table meta effects. That's good value blocking for you, especially because you don't have a lot of health. Feint is a good scheme to shuffle back because it heals you too. That's nice. That's Feint with an A, of course. And Holy Mackerel, along with maybe Nope Mine, would be good to shuffle back so that you could get the combo and make your opponent discard more cards. Overall, the cards you choose probably depend on the matchup and what you need, but I'd say a majority of the time you probably need defenses, so you're going to want to get some good blocks and or cancels back into your deck if you can. Because remember, you're shuffling these back into your deck, they're not going back into your hand, so you're not going to see them immediately. So maybe you're holding a couple of block cards in your hand and you say, I could afford to shuffle in some attacks. But that means your deck is getting even more diluted with attacks, and if you've already played a lot of good block cards, there's not going to be that many left. So I think you should be a defensive-oriented dumpster diver and get some block cards back. This is the opposite of timeout, because timeout you want to play as early as you can. This you want to use as late as you can so that you see more of your cards, you get to play your good ones, and that way when you shuffle them back in, you have the best options to choose from, and your deck is more concentrated with good cards. However, you can't hold on to this for too long and let your opponent discard it, especially if they have insight or eliminate the impossible or snicker snack or some way to look at your hand and pick a card for you to yeet, because they will pick this card because this is your best card. So in some matchups, you might have to play a little bit earlier than you would like, but as long as you're shuffling 5 cards back in, you really can't complain. That's a super powerful effect. And the fact that it also heals you is just a nice bonus. Honestly, this card doesn't even need the heal effect, and it would be one of the most powerful cards in the entire game. And that's all the cards. If you made it this far, you should give yourself a pat on the back, because that was no easy task for you, I'm sure. Let's start with the positives of this deck. It's fun to play. You cannot deny that at all. The Highlander deck concept was very interesting, and it was bound to happen eventually in Unmatched, and it really makes sense for it to have been this character. And that being said, the meta effects and the flavor text on the cards, and the fact that there's no real art, the graphic design team nailed the aesthetic of this deck, and it is really funny to just constantly read the cards as you're playing. As for the negatives, and I'm speaking from a competitive perspective here. From a casual perspective, it's probably a little bit different, but competitively, this character stinks. He's pretty bad. He can do some crazy stuff. There's a couple combos in there, as we saw, but he can't do any of those things consistently. And I think his weaknesses of being a Highlander deck and being really inconsistent far outweigh his strengths that he has in individual cards. And I think the lack of card draw is the real killer here. There's a great quote from Jeremy, or PoindexterG, that he posted on Discord a couple days ago, and it says, "Every game I've ever seen with Deadpool goes like this. He seems unstoppable at the start. He keeps hitting everyone. His health floats between 8 and 10. He just keeps attacking and healing. And then he runs out of defenses and goes down in 2 or 3 attacks." That's pretty much spot on for what my Deadpool experience is, just because you really don't have enough card draw and good blocks to sustain the inconsistent deck you have and the low health total you have as well. But I'm glad this character exists. I'm sure less ultra competitively minded people will enjoy him a lot more than I do, and Marvel fans especially should get a kick out of this deck. Unfortunately, I believe there's been a complication with the license, and I think it will expire before another printing will be possible. So if you have any interest at all in this character, I would try to order it or buy it ASAP as possible in order to get your hands on it. Although, since this video is coming out a couple weeks later than I would have liked it to be, it might be too late already. So I'm sorry. If you aren't interested in this character or the cards and are turned off by the relatively high cost of an individual hero, because this was like $3 more expensive than the Bruce Lee solo hero pack, or you're somehow into board games and not a collectionist or completionist, I think Deadpool is a perfectly understandable skip for you, even if you're interested in Unmatched. So obviously this video is coming out a while after my most recent post, and I'm sorry about the gap in content. I went on a vacation for like a month across the northeastern US, and I saw a bunch of friends and family, and I was having a grand old time. And before that trip, I was kind of feeling slightly burnt out of Unmatched, just because the tournament in August and September was just a lot. And I felt like I wanted to take a break instead of pushing myself and completely losing interest in this game entirely. Part of the post-tourney life was realizing that there are other areas of life besides just this singular board game. And the other issue is there hasn't been any new content in this game, save for Deadpool, of course, but he doesn't really count, since January when Red Wolf was released. And I know there's Battle of Legends coming out hopefully by the end of this year, and Houdini and the Genie and Jurassic Park 2 and the Marvel sets are right around the corner, but I just wanted to take a break to avoid completely burning out, and I hope everyone is just okay with that. I'm not sure when my next video will be because the holidays are coming up and I really don't have anything planned that much, but I think the Jurassic Park set will be next, and I'll put another poll out on YouTube to see if people want the Raptors or Muldoon first, and if anything else comes up, I'll try to keep you guys updated if I can. So that's all I have for you guys today. This was probably a decently long video. I'm sorry. So thank you for listening all the way through. Let's see some fruit emojis in the comments. And as always, like, subscribe, follow me on Instagram, and yeet!